The snow came early that year, but it was the wind that stole the breath from your lungs. It howled down the ridge like a living thing, flaying the skin from the trees, snatching doors clean off their hinges, and slamming shutters so hard the nails ripped out. The storm didn't sneak in. It arrived like a war. But before that, before the frost turned bones brittle, and the wind became a killer, the townsfolk had stood around laughing at a widow who ran a line of cloth from her root cellar to her barn, like she meant to hang laundry that'd never dry. It wasn't laundry, and it wasn't a joke, but no one saw that then, not when her name was Letty Dumas, not when she was 40 and widowed and childless, with only a lame dog for company and a voice hoarser than a field crow. Not when she moved to the edge of town and started sewing canvas strips together with a needle as thick as a finger. Not when she built that tunnel, flimsy and long, fluttering like a carnival tent in the prairie wind, stretching from her cabin's back door to the barn, and another arm to the woodshed, like a crooked Y rooted in the dirt. They called it the widow's windsock, said it'd blow away before first frost, said it was as useful as teats on a mule. But they didn't see her hands shake when she tied each corner down with stones she dug out with bleeding fingers. They didn't hear her coughing blood into her scarf, or see the burn scar that ran up her leg from where she once fell too close to the stove, alone, without anyone to drag her away from the flames. No one cared much. The town of Cairns Hollow had long since learned to look the other way when a woman started unraveling, easier than getting tangled in her sorrow. But all of that changed the night the blizzard came. That night started like any other, with the wind blowing hard but not angry. People shut their doors, threw extra logs in the stove, grumbled about dry kindling and frostbitten chickens. But by midnight the sky cracked open. A wall of white roared down off the high ridge, thick and fast and bitter cold, heavier than snow had any right to be. It didn't fall, it smothered. The ridge disappeared, then the trees, then the road. The town vanished under it like a candle smothered in lard. And in Letty's cabin the canvas tunnel groaned like a dying ox. But it held. The first to fall was the Schulman boy, 16, cocky, always out trapping late. He tried to run home from the creek when he saw the sky go white. They found his boots 3 days later frozen to the road. The boy himself curled in a drift like a baby trying to crawl back into the womb. Next was old Dunn, who'd gone to his shed for firewood and never came back. His widow found him with one arm extended toward the door, his fingers purple as overripe plums. But Letty made it to her woodshed, made it back again too, 3 times that night. She crawled through the cloth tunnel with the wind screaming like banshees just inches outside. Inside it was cold, but not deadly. The canvas snapped and bucked and spit snow from the seams, but she stayed low, dragging a sled behind her for firewood. Her dog, Jasper, limped beside her once, then wouldn't go out again. She didn't blame him. 2 nights later, the town's only midwife banged on Letty's door. Her name was Ruth Calder, broad as a barrel and mean as a kicked hornet. She was nearly blind in one eye and had delivered every child in town for 20 years. She wasn't one for apologies. That night she brought 2 toddlers with her, barefoot, frost-nipped, both howling. Said she'd found them alone in the McCrary place, fire gone out, parents missing. Her horse had frozen dead not 20 yards from Letty's barn. "Can't go back," she'd said, voice cracking. "Can't get out. Something's wrong. The snow ain't stopping. And the wind," she didn't finish. Letty gave her the last of the cornmeal and half her winter bacon. She poured melted snow water over the boys' hands, wrapped their feet in wool, and started rationing kindling like it was gold. By the next morning, 3 more came. And then 5 more the day after that. Each time they arrived pale, shaking, smoke-coated, half dead. Some had fled collapsing roofs. Others followed half memories of where Letty's strange tunnel once stood. One woman arrived crawling, holding her infant like a bundle of glass. They didn't knock. They just staggered into the cloth tunnel, crawling forward like animals lost in fog, drawn by the warmth bleeding through the seams, the faint smell of firewood smoke, or maybe just the mad hope that somewhere, anywhere, was better than the white hell swallowing Cairns Hollow. By the 5th day, Letty's cabin held 17 people. She turned the barn into a sleeping hall, lined it with hay and blankets and coats torn into strips. She rationed out what food she had left, rotated firewood runs through the tunnel, barked orders like a field sergeant. And when one child coughed blood, she hauled out the old boiling pot and steamed pine needles until the air turned thick and bitter and the coughing stopped. Still, the snow kept coming. It stacked against her tunnel like a giant's hand pressing down. The cloth sagged, the ropes groaned, but Letty reinforced every seam herself. Even when her fingers froze to the canvas, she'd stitch, then cough, then stitch again. She'd patch tears with shirt sleeves, sew with fishing line when thread ran out. They stopped calling it the windsock. They started calling it the lifeline. On the 10th day, someone tried to go back. George Talmy, his wife was still in town, and his baby hadn't made the walk. He waited till dawn, then slipped out the tunnel before anyone noticed. They found him the next day only 20 feet away, curled in the snow like a dog at the end of a leash. His eyes were open, so was his mouth, but his feet were gone. The wind had taken them. After that, no one tried to leave. The cloth tunnel, patched with shawls, petticoats, old flour sacks, and even a church banner, was the only safe passage in and out of Letty's home, and it never stretched more than 20 yards in any direction. The town was trapped somewhere beyond that curtain of white, and no one dared cross it again. The snow never let up. On the 12th day, Letty started to believe the sun itself had died, snuffed out beyond the endless blanket of white. No light pierced the gloom, only a blue-gray haze like lantern smoke trapped in a church crypt. The wind still screamed, not with the fury of a storm, but with the persistence of something ancient and hungry, gnawing, patient, something that didn't get tired. Inside her cabin, the heat from the stove could barely touch the corners of the room anymore. Frost painted the nails in the ceiling, the walls wept, and 17 souls breathed together like one. Warmth was shared, passed between bodies like an heirloom. They slept in piles, huddled together like pups in a den. It stank, it steamed, it kept them alive. Letty rationed the last of the flour into thin dumplings boiled in bitter spruce broth. She took the smallest portion each time, lying with a quiet lie in her mouth. 8 already. No one believed her, but no one called her on it either. There was something about her face by then, raw, wind-peeled, blackened fingers, voice little more than a whisper, that made people shut their mouths and listen. The tunnel had to be cleared every morning, like a lung that needed coughing out. The snow pressed against its sides until it nearly suffocated. Every morning, she or one of the stronger folk, usually Ruth Calder or young Elias Withrow, would go through, dragging a shovel like a crutch, jabbing at the ceiling, banging out the weight before it crushed them. If they waited too long, it iced over. Then it became a coffin. On the 13th morning, Elias didn't come back. Letty waited at the far mouth of the tunnel, arms trembling from holding the canvas open, the icy cloth stiff in her hands. She stared into the twisting dark, listened. Nothing. Only the breath of snow and wind howling beyond the seams. She went in after him. Halfway through, she found him stuck. The tunnel had bowed in hard where the snow drifted from the barn roof. Elias had tried to dig it out, but the shovel had broken. He was trapped between 2 folds, wedged like a cork in a bottle. His lips were blue, his eyes wide, but he was alive. Letty clawed the cloth loose with bare hands, screaming at him to move, to breathe. She tore at the canvas until the tunnel sagged like a torn sail, dragging him backward inch by inch, her breath ragged, her fingers numb beyond pain. The tunnel ripped a full foot along the spine. The cold poured in, but she got him out. They sewed that rip with a bedsheet and buttons, and no one used that stretch again for 2 days. That was when Letty began crawling it herself, twice a day, once to the barn, once to the woodshed. She did it slow, methodical, dragging a sled with rope lashed to her waist. She was half her size now, body curled into something wiry and tight, nothing left of the soft woman who used to bake cornbread and sing in a low hum when no one listened. They all listened now. The town, invisible in the distance, had gone silent. No smoke on the wind, no footsteps in the snow, no dogs barking, only white, endless white. Even Ruth, tough as barn nails, started whispering at night that maybe they were the only ones left. "This might be it," she muttered. "Whole town's gone under. Like the Donner Pass." She spoke the name like it was a curse, like saying it too loud might invite ghosts, but Letty shook her head. "They're alive," she rasped, skin cracking at the corners of her lips. "Just can't reach us. Not yet." They didn't ask how she knew. She had become something more than a woman by then, a fixture, a presence. The way a lighthouse is never asked why it still burns when the sea swallows everything else. She just kept moving, sewing, shoveling, feeding mouths with less and less each day. And then the baby fell sick. Her name was Cora, barely 6 months old. Skin like milk, lungs weak from the start. She belonged to Mabel Kettering, a quiet woman with nervous hands who hadn't spoken much since her husband froze in his own yard. Cora coughed once, then again, then refused milk. Ruth did what she could, herbal steam, chest rubs, warm cloth, but the child's breathing thinned. Mabel wailed soundlessly, her mouth open but no sound escaping, like her soul had turned to glass and cracked from the inside. Letty pulled a wool cloak around her shoulders, tied a scarf over her mouth, and went through the tunnel, to the church. The only place left in town with a bell, and maybe, just maybe, a lantern, a prayer book, something, anything. Her cloth tunnel didn't stretch that far. She had to make it past the barn, out into the white, and then across the field. She took the sled. No one stopped her. No one followed. They all thought she'd die. The wind outside clawed at her, cutting straight through every stitch of clothing like hot needles. The snow wasn't snow anymore. It was salt poured from heaven, blinding and raw. She leaned into it, crawling more than walking, dragging the sled with one hand, the other wrapped around the rope knotted at her waist like a lifeline. She marked her trail with red cloth tied to twigs, stabbing them into the drifts every few yards. But the wind took half of them. She reached the church 2 hours later. The doors were buried in snow. She had to dig down, clawing with her bare hands, fingers bleeding in her mittens, until she could slip inside through a crack in the side window. Inside, it was as silent as a grave. Benches were overturned. A kettle sat frozen on the old wood stove. The hymnals were covered in frost, but there was a lantern and oil and candles. She took them all, stuffing them into a sack, then loaded the sled and turned to leave, and saw the shape near the altar, a man, or what had once been one, half frozen, one eye open, staring without seeing, tongue black, hands still pressed together in prayer. She stepped around him without a word. When she returned, the baby was worse. Mabel rocked her, whispering lullabies that had no words, only melody, cracked and trembling. Letty lit a candle, then she boiled snow water in the old kettle. She dipped a clean cloth in the hot water and pressed it gently against the child's chest, over and over. Ruth stood by, arms folded, teeth clenched. "You'll drown her lungs," she said. "Better than freezing them," Letty whispered back. The baby lived. By dawn, her cough had faded. Her skin was pink again, and no one doubted Letty after that. They moved the children into the barn full-time, insulated it with canvas and hay. The tunnel now connected the cabin, woodshed and barn, 3 branches that curved like ribs around the heart of survival. The seams were patched daily, fires lit in shifts. The rationing became an art form. And then came the knocking, soft, hesitant, from the edge of the tunnel. 2 men, half dead, faces split with frostbite, one missing a glove, the other dragging a broken foot behind him. They'd come from town. Said it had collapsed in places, roofs gone, ice in the wells. One store caught fire and then froze, charred wood glittering like obsidian. Said maybe half the town was dead, maybe more, but they'd seen the cloth tunnel and followed it. They weren't the last. By day 17, Letty's shelter held over 30. Some she'd known for years, others only by reputation. One was a man who once mocked her so loudly in the saloon that she'd left in tears. Now he bowed his head when she passed, silent. The cloth tunnel was no longer just canvas. It was a lifeline, a symbol, the only proof that something human still fought against the freeze. And still, the snow kept falling. The storm was no longer a visitor. It had become a kingdom, a white kingdom of muffled sound and breathless air, where every tree was buried to its knees, where chimneys vanished under drifts, and fences ceased to exist. And in the heart of it, Letty Dumas' cloth tunnel kept breathing like the lung of a beast too stubborn to die. It snapped and groaned and wept frost from its seams, but it lived. And because it lived, so did the people inside. By the 20th day, the shelter was holding 37. No one had slept alone in over a week. Even the barn, once the overflow sleeping hall, was packed shoulder to shoulder with shivering, whispering bodies. The horses were gone. Those that hadn't frozen had been slaughtered early to save the children. The meat was almost gone too. The root cellar, its shelves once lined with preserves and pickled beans and dried apples, now echoed. All that remained were a few onions and jars of lard, crusted at the rim. Letty kept count in a little notebook, the pencil shaved down to a stub: names, portions, firewood loads, tasks, temperature estimates. At the top of every page, she wrote the date. She was the only one still tracking time, as if writing it down might hold the world together. People had stopped asking when the storm would end. That question belonged to the early days. Hope had become quieter, more cautious. Now they asked smaller things. Will the tunnel hold another night? Can we spare more broth? Whose turn is it to break the ice barrel? Survival had become mechanical, one motion after the next. Shovel, mend, haul, soothe, feed, sleep. Still, the tunnel endured, but it was weaker. On day 23, one of the ropes anchoring the west wing to the barn snapped. The canvas flailed like a gutted sail, sending 2 boys tumbling into the snow. Elias Withrow ran out and dragged them back, one under each arm, roaring for someone to help. They were blue at the edges, lashes iced shut, but they lived. That night, Letty sat in the tunnel with a candle in one hand and a strip of cloth in the other, sewing the seam back together in the dark. She didn't go back inside until the candle burned her fingers. Ruth begged her to rest. "You keep going like this, we'll bury you before the thaw," she said, stirring a pot of pine bark tea for the 3rd time that day. Letty didn't respond. She hadn't said much in days. Her lips had cracked, then bled, then scabbed over. Her eyes were ringed with shadow, and her fingers wrapped in bandages gone grey with use. But when she walked, people moved aside. When she pointed, they followed. She had become less a woman than a storm herself, quiet, endless, cold-eyed, and somehow still standing. That night a boy died, Henry Weems, 8 years old. He had been found 2 weeks earlier in a barn on the far end of town, curled beneath a haystack with a dead goat and a hammer in his fist. He never spoke a word, not one, from the moment he was brought in, but he never cried either. Ruth had said he might recover, but when Letty went to rouse him that night, his lips were white, his breath gone. There was no wailing, no sermon, no grave. The snow was too deep, the ground too hard. Letty wrapped him in one of the last wool blankets and took him into the woodshed herself. There she placed his small body in a hay-lined trough, covered him with old coats, and nailed a sign above it. Henry. No one asked where he was the next day. No one had to. The next morning, Ruth's eye was swollen shut. An infection. She refused to slow down, but Letty forced her to stay inside, stripped bark from the last willow tree near the tunnel's edge, and boiled it until it stank like old tea and tar. She poured it into a cup and stood over Ruth until she drank it all. "You think I'm gonna live?" Ruth croaked, smiling despite herself. "You're too mean to die," Letty rasped. That was the first time they'd laughed in days. But the truth was, Letty wasn't sure how many more nights the tunnel could take. The cloth was thinning in places. Every gust of wind sounded like a groan from deep inside a wounded animal. The seams were so tight with stitches, there was no space left for new thread. The ropes frayed, the poles cracked. Even the stones she used to anchor the base had begun to shift beneath the pressure of the drifts. She needed wood, real wood, the kind that would burn slow and hot. So on day 25, she made the call, the town lumbermill. It was 3 streets over, half a mile. No tunnel stretched that far. No one had been there since the storm began. Most believed it had collapsed, but Letty knew better. "Too many beams," she said, hunched over the map she'd carved into the dirt floor. "If it's still standing, it's warm inside. Even if not, we can drag the planks back. Fuel, tools, maybe even food." "You won't make it," said Elias, "not without shelter." "Then we build shelter." She said it like it was simple, like she was planning to walk to the neighbors for sugar, and she did build it. That night, with every scrap of spare cloth and canvas, they stitched together a new length, 40 feet long, narrow, barely tall enough to crawl through. It took 14 hours. When it was done, she tied it to the main tunnel, then stretched it out across the snow, anchoring it with everything they had: sleds, rocks, broken chairs, even a Bible wrapped in oilcloth. Then she crawled in. She dragged the sled behind her, crawling inch by inch through a tunnel, so new the seams still bled thread. Her breath formed a trail of ice behind her. The canvas snapped above like a bird trying to escape. Her knees were bloodied before the first 20 yards, and then it collapsed. A drift rolled down from the top of a slope and crushed the new tunnel flat, but she was still inside it. The wind jammed snow into every opening. The cloth pressed to her back. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her fingers scrabbled at the side walls, trying to find the seam, the rope, and then a hand burst through from the far end. Elias. He'd followed her without asking. He dragged her out like pulling a worm from a burrow, both of them panting, half buried already by the next gust. She didn't thank him, just nodded, got up, started walking again. The mill was still standing. It was half collapsed on one side, but the office was intact, the windows shattered but the roof whole. Inside, they found splinters, nails, and 7 whole planks still dry, a barrel of kerosene, a broken cot, and a sack of old grain, sprouted and grey, but still grain. They hauled it back over 3 trips, built a new tunnel section with the planks, creating a kind of trench roofed with canvas. Not warm, not strong, but passable, and the tunnel grew longer. The wind howled louder. The people inside whispered less. One night, Letty woke to the sound of a child calling for her. She rose from her cot, if a pile of straw and coats could be called that, and made her way to the tunnel entrance. The wind was silent, still. It made her freeze in place. She stepped outside the cloth tunnel and saw it. The snow had stopped. For the first time in nearly 30 days, the sky was visible. A pale grey dome overhead, still as bone. The drifts sparkled in moonlight. No clouds, no wind. Silence so thick it felt holy. One by one, the others rose. They stepped outside, blinking like animals coming out of hibernation. No one spoke. Even the children held their breath. And in that silence, Letty looked back at the tunnel. It stretched behind her like a scar across the snow, crooked and patchworked and sagging, but alive. It had lived, so had they. But she knew the danger wasn't over. Snow that deep would take weeks to melt. Supplies were still gone, and no one had seen the center of town since the first day of the storm. There might be survivors, there might be none, and someone had to go check. Someone had to rebuild the bridge between this makeshift life and the one that had been left behind. And Letty knew it would be her. When dawn broke the next morning, pale and bruised like a newborn sky gasping through the haze, Letty didn't stop to celebrate. She knew the storm's retreat was only half the battle. A quiet sky meant nothing if you had no town left to return to, no neighbors left breathing, and no fuel to last the thaw. Silence, she'd learned, wasn't always a blessing. Sometimes it meant the world had died. The cold hadn't softened. It still bit, still chewed at knuckles and toes, still demanded sacrifice with every breath, but the wind was gone. That alone was enough. By first light, she had a new plan. Cairns Hollow was somewhere out there, half a mile, maybe a bit more if the drifts hadn't shifted landmarks beyond recognition. The map in her mind was sharp enough. Cross the old pasture, angle past the collapsed saloon, skirt the stone mill, and follow the frozen creek to the main square. But none of that meant anything if the snow had remade the world. Still, she was going. Letty wrapped herself in every layer she had left. 2 coats, 3 scarves, fingerless gloves stuffed with wool, boots with cracked soles layered in rags. Ruth tried to stop her, but her protest was a ghost of a whisper by now. No one else volunteered, not because they were cowards, but because they all knew Letty had become something else during the storm. You didn't send anyone else through the snow. You sent the one who'd built tunnels from scraps, held back death with a sewing needle, and turned canvas into salvation. She tied a rope around her waist, the end looped back to a post in the main cloth tunnel. If she didn't return in 2 hours, they'd know to pull. Elias stood beside her before she left. He held out a thermos of warm pine needle broth. His hands were shaking. "You come back, yeah?" he said, eyes narrowed. "Plan to," she whispered, and then she was gone. The snow was deeper than she'd expected, waist-high in places, crusted on top but fragile beneath, like walking on broken meringue. Her legs burned, her breath turned to fog. She counted each step like a prayer. 20, 40, stop, listen, breathe. Again, she found the saloon by the curve of its broken signpost. Only a shard remained. "Hello," poking from adrift like a snapped tooth. The front door was gone, the windows blown out. She peeked inside and saw only wreckage, frozen chairs, overturned tables. The ceiling collapsed inward like an open ribcage. No bodies. She moved on. Next was the chapel, the one she'd visited before, on the day she brought back oil and candles, and found that man frozen near the altar. This time she didn't go inside. She only stood at the edge of the shattered porch and listened. The door creaked in the windless air. The snow groaned beneath her, but nothing human stirred. No footsteps, no voices, no crying. The town square should have been next. She almost missed it. The snow had transformed it into a smooth basin, the well nothing more than a lump in the middle. Around it, what remained of buildings poked up like rotten teeth. She circled the edge, calling softly, "Hello?" Her voice cracked. It felt like shouting into a crypt. And then, movement. A window shutter flapped, a shadow behind glass. She turned fast, staggered through the drift toward it. It was the butcher's house. She slammed on the frame. "It's Letty! Letty Dumas! Anyone alive in there?" No answer, but the door creaked open. Inside, she found 3 people, barely conscious, wrapped in rugs and half-frozen coats. A girl no older than 10, a man with purple fingers, and an old woman with a crucifix frozen to her chest. They stared at her, like she was a ghost. "I've got a shelter," Letty rasped. "Food, warmth. You need to move." The girl started crying. The man tried to stand, but couldn't. It took 2 trips to get them back. She fashioned a makeshift sled with a shutter torn from the butcher's window and lashed it with wire, pulled it herself. Her fingers bled, her back screamed, but she made it. When she stumbled into the cloth tunnel, dragging the man across the snow like a sack of coal, people gasped. Some wept, others cheered, but softly, afraid the sound might break the fragile magic holding them all together. The man she brought back had no words, only tears. He clasped Letty's hand and kissed her fingers. They fed him broth, stripped his dead boots, wrapped him in coats. The girl wouldn't stop holding Letty's arm for hours. By nightfall, Letty slept for the first time in nearly a week. Not the fevered half-rest she'd grown used to, but a true sleep full of silence and dark, dreamless blankness. She woke up 12 hours later. The cloth tunnel held. The air was still. The first crows returned that morning. One perched on the woodshed and cawed once, sharp and clear. It was the first sound of the world returning. Over the next 3 days, they used the new wooden trench to ferry survivors from the center of town to the shelter. 15 more arrived, some frostbitten, some mute with trauma, others grateful beyond words. One man knelt before Letty and sobbed into her skirts. She had to stiffen her back to keep from falling apart. She never wanted worship, only survival. The cloth tunnel expanded again. This time the canvas was bolstered with scrap tin and wooden struts from the mill. The children helped sew. The teenagers ran shifts clearing snow. Ruth oversaw rations. Elias did the heavy hauling. And Letty planned. She always planned. She plotted a new path to the general store. It was a risk. The building had burned, they said, but its basement might still hold supplies. Salt, flour, beans in tins. Anything was better than the broth of boiled bark and snow they'd been living on. So she went. The general store was half gone, a charred husk that leaned into the wind like a drunk praying to fall. But she found the trapdoor intact, hidden beneath a sheet of ice. It took an axe and 2 hours of chopping to break through. When she opened it, the smell hit her first. Rot, smoke, cold iron, but also beans, salt, coffee. She sobbed when she saw the tin can with the label still on. She didn't even like coffee, but it was civilization, proof that something human had survived beneath all the frost. She loaded what she could on the sled and left the rest marked for later. That night, she served warm beans to the children first. The older ones cried as they ate. The younger ones licked the bowls. And for the first time in weeks, Letty smiled. Just a flicker, but it was real. The next morning, she rose early before the others. She walked to the tunnel's end where it opened toward the barn, now bustling with bodies and makeshift beds. She stared out across the drifted white. The storm was over. The snow would thaw, slow and mean, revealing what it had swallowed. But already crows flew, trees groaned with returning sap. The creek began to crack open its icy shell. Letty picked up her notebook. She crossed out a name, not because someone had died, but because one of the missing had returned. Mary Chafford, presumed lost, found alive in the old schoolhouse, half-starved but breathing. That was name number 49. And Letty Dumas' tunnel had saved everyone. They stopped calling it a tunnel by then. They called it a bridge, not just between buildings, but between despair and survival. And Letty, the widow once mocked for sewing cloth in the wind, became something else entirely. They never did rebuild the town square exactly how it was, but they left the cloth tunnel standing long after the thaw, replacing its canvas with oilskin, its ropes with lumber, and every spring the children were made to walk its length, tracing the path their parents had once crawled through, learning how lives had been stitched together one desperate seam at a time. And somewhere inside, in the center where 3 paths met, barn, cabin, woodshed, stood the old flag Ruth Calder had once hung to patch a hole. It read, "The Lord is my shelter. No one ever took it down." By the time the thaw came fully, a real melt, not the teasing crusts of warmth that lured people outside only to slam the freeze shut again, most of Cairns Hollow had been remade, not rebuilt, not yet, but remade in the minds of those who'd survived. The old town they remembered, the one of split rail fences, worn porches, Sunday sermons and Friday dances, was gone, buried under 6 feet of hard white silence. What emerged as the snow withdrew was a different place, and its shape had been carved by a widow's hands. Letty Dumas didn't want thanks. She didn't even accept them, not out loud. When people came to her with eyes wide, words clumsy, hats in their hands and gratitude on their tongues, she only nodded or walked away, or said something low like, "Don't matter now, go help Ruth boil the next batch." But the children followed her. Always. She tried to ignore them, but they clung to her coat when she passed, helped her with wood unasked, listened when she told them to sew tighter seams or stack stones higher to anchor the rebuilt tunnel. They whispered about her when they thought she couldn't hear. Is it true she went into the storm 3 times? My ma says she found the butcher's girl in the dark. Someone said she kept her own fire out just to save wood for the rest. All of it was true, and none of it was enough to capture what had really happened inside the cloth tunnel. It hadn't just kept them from freezing. It had made them something else, a tribe, a communion, a circle of warmth that couldn't be broken. It was the opposite of the storm, where the blizzard had tried to scatter them, isolate them, smother them in white silence. The tunnel had pulled them close, taught them to share, to ration, to survive, not by strength, but by proximity, by breathing the same thin air together and choosing not to hoard it. By April, they began burying the dead. The thaw revealed the Schulman boy curled near the creek. His hands were still outstretched, frozen mid-motion. The Dunn man was found just feet from his own shed, now collapsed over him. 3 more were discovered near the general store, their bodies locked together in a huddle, as if they'd tried to shield each other from the end. The townsfolk dug the graves by hand. No one spoke. Letty stood by each one, lips pressed thin, hat clutched in both hands. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the first week. There was something dry in her now, like her tears had burned off somewhere deep in the tunnel. They buried Henry Weems last. His trough coffin was carried out by 4 boys, all younger than 12. Ruth read a psalm. The children placed pieces of cloth, scraps from the tunnel seams, over his body before they covered him with soil. It was Elias who carved his name into a piece of cedar and placed it at the head. There was no priest, no sermons, but there was reverence and silence. Later that week, the mayor's son returned. He'd been trapped in a logging camp upriver. He came riding into town with a mule and a half-frozen face and a look of wonder when he saw the cloth tunnel still standing. He asked who built it. Everyone pointed to Letty. He looked her up and down, the hunched back, the fingers wrapped in fresh bandages, the ragged shawl stitched so many times it looked like patchwork armor, and said, "We ought to name it after her," she snorted. "It's canvas and twine. Ain't a monument." It is now. That night, they painted a sign, canvas stretched tight over 2 bent fence posts, black ink, thick and bold. The Lifeline, built by Letty Dumas, savior of Cairns Hollow. She tried to take it down twice, but they hammered it back every time. The name stuck. Eventually, the tunnel was replaced with timber, then with a covered walkway. But no one forgot what it had been. And even as modern cabins went up again, as the general store was rebuilt, the saloon's roof repaired, and the schoolhouse unboarded, people still followed the same path through town, down the ridge, through what had once been the tunnel between the barn, woodshed, and old cabin. A woman named Letta, named after Letty herself, was born that fall. The baby whose life was nearly lost to cough and cold, little Cora, learned to walk that summer by toddling back and forth along the tunnel's ghost path, tracing the memory of warmth that had once pulsed through its canvas walls. And Ruth survived, kept her eye too. She swore it was the pine bark tea. More likely it was Letty holding her upright through fever and frostbite. Ruth never said as much, but she began sewing again, quilts this time, stitched with cloth saved from the tunnel's final days. She gave the first one to Letty, black thread, white backing, in the center a red strip of canvas, tattered, frayed, but intact. "It's the first seam you stitched," Ruth said, "the one to the barn." Letty held it like a baby. For a long time she didn't speak. Then, "Ain't much to look at," Ruth smiled. "Neither were we." And yet, as for Elias, he built a real bridge over the creek come spring, said it felt wrong to walk across it without remembering the cloth under his boots. He left a scrap of the old canvas nailed to the underside of the bridge's beam. Just a piece, just a memory, but it stayed. Years passed. The town changed. New families moved in, old ones left. But every winter, when the first real snow came, when the wind howled just a little too hard through the trees, the children would gather near the barn and run from door to door along the old tunnel path, clutching each other's hands and laughing, daring one another to make the full loop like their grandparents had. And every time they passed Letty's cabin, still standing, still warm, still square against the wind, they'd quiet down. Some of them said the cloth tunnel still whispered at night, that if you stood real still near the woodshed and listened close, you could hear the sound of stitches being pulled tight. Others said it was just the wind, but either way, they never tore it down. They left the posts, the worn rope lines, even the tattered cloth that flapped like prayer flags in the cold, because it wasn't just a tunnel anymore. It was proof that one woman, mocked and alone, with nothing but rags, needle, and will, had held back a storm that killed half a valley. Proof that warmth could be made from scraps, that survival didn't always come from the strongest shoulders or loudest voices, but from the stubborn, shaking hands of a widow who refused to stop sewing. "Let them laugh," they said. "Let them laugh next time." Because now, the town knew, a cloth tunnel wasn't useless, not when stitched by the right hands. Not when wind and white death came screaming through the trees, and especially not when a widow remembered every name, every breath, every soul that ever crawled through it in the dark.